21 helicopters might be destroyed and damaged in that one single ATACMS strike. We are going to talk about this in this situational picture, as well as about the other heavy losses the Russians have suffered in their attempt to encircle Avdiivka. And we'll talk about the developments along the front line, and of course especially about the bridgehead the Ukrainians set up on the left bank of the Dnipro river. Hello and welcome to this situational picture. We are starting in the northern part of the eastern front line. The Russians are being reported to attack at various points along the whole front line. A lot of towns are being mentioned where attacks were happening. I can only confirm one success though. They have been somewhat successful close to Yahidne, where they were geolocalized. And if we see here Ivanivke and Yahidne, then this is more or less up here where the Russians have been able to advance somewhat. Ukrainians did counterattack at several points, among them Sinkivka, Ivanivka, Novoye-Horivka, Makivka, and the Serebryanske forest. So Novoye-Horivka, Makivka is down here in the Serebryanske forest, and Sinkivka up here. So we see Ukrainian counterattacks along the whole front line as well, but none of them has shown any success. South of the Siersky Donetsk, there are additional reports about successes for the Ukrainians close to Bakhmut. The Ukrainians say they crossed the railroad line, and we do have a small Russian military blogger confirming that they are behind that they have crossed the railroad line, but it's a very small one that I haven't stumbled over before, so I cannot say much how reliable he is. There's still some doubt, and I have not seen better new geolocalization whether the Ukrainians actually now have a permanent base on the other side of the railroad line. Close to Avdiivka, the Russians are continuing to attack, and they have additional successes. We have here a new fresh geolocalization right northwest of Spartak, and this is here. And we see that this is this area here. So the Russians are now here and hold this position. They have advanced somewhat here. This isn't much in meters. If we take it, it's like 400 meters, but it's still very important, as those are the fortifications that held the Russians back for years. We're talking about a front line that has established between 2014 and 2015, and that held back the Russians since the beginning of the full-scale war in February 2022. So these gains they make down here south, they might be small measured in meters, but they are fairly important because they are now capturing positions that they weren't able to capture for 1.5 years in a row. Also, we have a Ukrainian military blogger claiming that they gained several hundred meters from Spartak to Avdiivka, from Vodiane to Netalilovo, and from Vodiane to Tenenkoye. I cannot confirm any of this. Like, in which direction? So basically up here that they gained something. What I have not seen is fresh evidence to these other advances. I'm not completely sure whether he's just summarizing which successes they had in the past, because we do know that the Russians recently captured this area here, and that's a couple of hundred meters. That's a couple of hundred meters here. So in total, it's probably true, but it might not be fresh advances in the last 24 to 48 hours. So it's unclear there, but we do see that the Russians slowly creep further forwards. They also had some success close to Novomikhailivka, down here, south of Marinka. Marinka, obviously, there's also still combat going on, but here at Novomikhailivka, we have another geolocalization, which is here where they have been, and they're in northeast of Novomikhailivka, they have advanced, which is also fairly significant because we see the end of the town here. And this here is right next to the town itself. It should be here if I'm not completely wrong. So they have advanced inside the tree line there. Novomikhailivka is obviously protection for Marinka to protect Marinka from an envelopment. This position generally is extremely important for the Ukrainians. As we can see here, there's a railroad line here. This is not in operation right now, but should the Russians be able to push the Ukrainians, let's say to this line here further back, then they can probably re-establish the railroad connection, and they would have a fully functional resupply line through the whole south, which right now they don't have except over the Kerch Bridge and then through the Crimean Peninsula. At Vuhledar, there are Russian attacks being reported close here at Shevchenko. They pushed somewhat in that direction, but I do not see that they have had any success in those attacks. And from the Oblast border, we do have the reports of Russian attacks close to Priyutne. They seem to have managed to push the Ukrainians somewhat back here. They also attacked at Staromayorske and Uroshaine, so on both sides of the river here. And from Novodonetsk, they attacked further north. The Ukrainians, when there are reports about Ukrainian attacks, it's usually we are now at a level that they only talk about sabotage groups, which should mean a couple of people, but no longer serious attempts to take Russian positions, which means that we can conclude now about this area south of Velika Novosilka that the initiative has switched over to the Russians here. I don't think there is much doubt about this anymore. At Orikhiv, fighting is also continuing here, where the Ukrainians have managed to breach the Russian defenses. The Ukrainian General Staff is reporting successes close to Robotine and to Verbobe. No proof of what they actually achieved, and the Ukrainians have been somewhat successful northwest of Verbove. They pushed the Russians a little back here in the tree line. While this is nice, and while the Ukrainian General Staff claimed that they have gained 400 meters, but while I don't see any admission of that, and I don't find any picture, any visual evidence, we do have visual evidence to the contrary, and there is a position with a BMD-4 and a tank, so some air assault units, they are the ones using BMDs, and it's geolocalized here. And this is unpleasant because we see Novoprokopivka here. And if we zoom in, now let me quickly see here. Now here we see a line going down. That is this one here. And this one should be to the east then, probably somewhere here, if I am not completely mistaken. Yeah, it's easy to see that line over here and that line over here. So the Russians have managed to advance to that point, which is here. Now they haven't just crossed the so-called gray zone, the contested area. They have re-entered area where the Ukrainians had already pushed them back. Now they are back here, having pushed back the Ukrainians by probably a couple of 100 meters in this position. Also not exactly great news. On the bridgehead over the Dnipro, it is definitely established now. While the Russians have been successful in pushing them somewhat back, it's mostly concentrated. Their biggest success was here, close to the remnants of the railroad bridge over the Dnipro. The numbers were that initially in company size 2 marine brigades have crossed the river. They managed to advance into the towns here and have been pushed somewhat. According to conflicting reports, they might still be in the outskirts of some towns, but we can more or less say that the Russians definitely don't control the area anymore until this year. While they likely have been pushed back, they are still settled now here on the area and have the railroad bridge for some additional cover. Whether this will allow them to create a bridgehead over the Dnipro that allows them to advance is obviously a completely different story, and we are nowhere close to being able to see this as a perspective. It will force the Russians to redeploy reinforcements, especially with the threat being maintained while they are still on the left bank of the Dnipro. They can bring in reinforcements, but so far no heavy equipment has been observed on the left bank of the Dnipro, which still means this is more or less a raid than a serious offensive, at least when we look at the perspective such a river crossing has, without heavy equipment, without vehicles, without IFVs to advance further. They are fixed to moving with their feet, to walking, and that obviously limits any hopes they can have of overwhelming and then overrunning the Russian defenses. Generally, though, even though that's a lot of bad news for the Ukrainians, it doesn't look that horrifying. There are reports about now we have additional pictures from the attacks on Berdyansk and Luhansk, which was done using the freshly delivered ATACMS missiles. And on the pictures, additional satellite pictures are popping up where where it can be compared with previous pictures where helicopters were, whether the ground is scorched, and items and details like this. So we are still in an area where it's more or less a little inaccurate, but we do have some data. And while the initial claims, excuse me, while the initial claims were that the Ukrainians might have destroyed up to 10, I think the Ukrainians themselves said it was 9. Now we have number that apparently up to 21 helicopters either are destroyed or damaged. The damage itself is obviously up for discussion. There's a picture being circled around. This is supposedly a Kamov 52 that was hit with that. We see damage here, we see damage on the canopy. That doesn't necessarily mean this helicopter is destroyed. It's very likely not going to fly anytime soon, but how fast this can be repaired, probably even an expert might have some issues determining it with a picture just that small. And at the same time, it's also obviously a question of spare parts, of capacities, because this will probably have to go at least to a specific air maintenance facility. So while we do not know how many of those 21 helicopters are out of the picture permanently, a lot of them will definitely be out for weeks, if not months, or it might even be longer. So this was a huge success, and it shows us again what problems the Ukrainians are facing. In the past they have had the accusation or the complaint that they don't use NATO tactics in the south, especially here at Orikhiv, where we see them attacking in small infantry groups, more or less aiming at attrition. And the complaint that they don't use NATO doctrine is a little less, it should be seen in the context, because I do not think NATO attacks on the ground without having struck the airports first, without taking out the enemy's ground, the close air support. But ATACMS, for instance, weren't delivered to Ukraine despite being available when Ukraine was supposed to start its counteroffensive. So what we see here are clear examples of misjudgment from the Western allies of Ukraine, which didn't supply Ukraine with equipment that would have urgently been needed at the beginning of the counteroffensive. We've seen in the past videos of combat helicopters taking out armored fighting vehicles in those attacks in the south here. Those helicopters might not have flown if their airports had been struck with ATACMS before the attack started, and the attacks wouldn't have had to happen in June if the tank deliveries hadn't waited until that long either. So we'll see here what capabilities could have been given to Ukraine earlier but haven't been done, and the discussion will obviously be what the political consequences are. We also have news about the losses the Russians have suffered around Avdiivka. On pictures and videos identified so far are 45 armored fighting vehicles, from tanks to IFVs to APCs, BTRs. They use a lot of BTRs there. Also MBTs, so classic tanks, as well as IFVs. 45 of them, that's the setup of a whole battalion tactical group. So one was completely wiped out in the attacks of Avdiivka, and that's just what we already know by visual evidence. And the numbers that are being circulated around, that supposedly are fairly accurate. Estimates are that the Russians suffered at least 3,000 casualties. They are so wounded and killed in the fighting for Avdiivka in just, 10, 14 days. Heavy losses, a lot of it is visual evidence as well. There are almost fields filled with corpses where the Russians have attacked in the past. Obviously, I can't show it to you on YouTube because YouTube isn't too happy about me presenting pictures like this, and some of you might not want to see those pictures, but if you're interested in them, you shouldn't have any trouble finding them either on Telegram or on Twitter if you search for them. Also, from the Crimean Peninsula, we have additional news as well. It was attacked again with ballistic missiles from the Ukrainians. The discussions among the Russian military commenters and bloggers are uncertain whether it was S-200 surface-to-air missiles, of which the Ukrainians still had a fair amount, but no longer in service. They refurbished them and changed them to a ground-to-ground missile, basically using the rocket engine of the SAM system and adding a new guided missile system to allow them to strike deeper into Russian-held territory. Either two of them were used, or the other option would be that the Ukrainians used their Hrim 2 missiles that they domestically developed and that have seemingly been used a couple of times, even though by now there are still discussions how much of those missiles that were used are actually Hrim 2 and how many of them were S-200, which isn't completely clear. Also, final news we have is that the Russians have moved dolphins, their dolphin unit here to Novoserne. This is interesting insofar as the Russians do have military dolphins. They are trained usually dolphins are trained to attack combat divers or to identify mines, for instance. And by moving those units here, it seems that they are afraid of Ukrainian commando raids in this area. Otherwise, it would make little sense for them to use them here. And we've seen a couple of Ukrainian raids, especially on the peninsula here in the past months, roughly 2 months. So we see the context here of the Russians providing dolphin, actually you could call them combat dolphins, into the area here by moving them there. That was it from me for now. Tomorrow we are going to do the longer situation report, where I'm going to talk about troop generation, that efforts by both sides. We have some more information about the losses as well from the Russian side, but today I'm going to keep the situational picture rather short. We're also going to talk about political connections and dive deeper into the details. So if you don't want to miss that, I would like to invite you to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon so you don't miss future videos. And if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. It really helps with the algorithm. And leave a comment. What do you think, how long the Russians will be able to keep up their push towards Avdiivka, or whether they are going to be successful with this? We have seen some successes, and some of them, while they might be small in meters, are fairly important as they've taken important fortifications. But leave your comment what you think, how it's going to turn out. That's it from me for now. This channel is only possible because of viewers like you. If you like to support the channel, you can do so by the means in the description. Thank you very much for everyone already supporting this channel. And as said, that's it from me for now. Thank you for watching, and I'll be back.